Welcome today. We have Sherri Cobb, Monica Carrier, and Adriana Furlong, who are in our current show at Rhombus Space. Hi, Dawn, coming in from Mexico. The exhibition is called Intensity, and it's a 3-month show online from June 1st to August 31st. And the artists participating in the show are Monica Carrier, Sherri Cobb, Dave Dexter, Carlos Dye, Bruce Eichelberger, Don Fritz, Adriana Furlong, and Sam Ticknor. And this show is basically a concept that I came up with at the beginning of the year to have 4 shows, each show relating to the season. So spring growth, summer intensity, fall bounty, and winter reflection. Nice. And I invited 4 artists whose work I felt like had a degree of intensity, dealing with the aftermath of the surge of hardships experienced during the pandemic, and as the aftershocks, realizations, and ferocity of shifted realities start to set in, Intensity aims to offer us a way to express all this trauma, displacement, and emotional reckoning. The artists in this exhibition walk the line of acceptable taboo, hidden visible, trauma healing, to find a voice for uncomfortable perspectives that challenge the masking veil of the status quo. I thought we could start with looking at the show. So if you enter Rhombus Space, the entrance to the show is on the first page. So we'll just pause here since we're starting with Sherri. So I would love to hear about your process, because when I think about your studio, I think about like this really surge of physicality involved. So could you talk a little bit about this piece?
Sure. This, I love that we chose this piece for this show because it represents all things intense. That means for me, this was a piece that I made. This is a painting made directly onto raw cotton. So it's a stain painting. That's my MO. It's golden paint directly applied to raw canvas. Let's just talk about the materials first, I guess. And I mix the color, I dilute it down so that I have a very thinned out pigment, so that I can apply it almost like a watercolor. And what's nice about that, and what's nice about working directly on raw cotton, is you get, in a way, depending on the weave, I tend to go with a number 12 because I get more threads per square inch, so it gives it a little bit more HD. And working directly on the canvas itself, it gives a light box effect. So I can get really beautiful transparencies, and I can get, as the pigment crosses another pigment, you get thicknesses that create another almost veiling of the color itself, either colored same tone on tone. So this particular piece also has an extreme performative aspect to it. I made it during a live performance where I invited a limited number of guests in June of 2019. It was, I think, June 9th. And I performed to Led Zeppelin 3 album, which was the year I was born, which was 1970. It's a 45-minute album. And I was trying to celebrate a moment in time where things were more analog and a little bit more intimate. And so I wanted to recreate a 1970s experience for my audience, and bring back the 70s performative aspect of our art history, our contemporary art history. So this piece was made in one night.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. And so when you make your work, are you have it on the floor and you're circumambulating?
Yeah, so this piece, I call it, when I work behind me, I call it the paint arena. This is where my painting is placed face up in the horizontal plane, and I'm working around all 4 sides, considering all 4 sides. And I'm aware of painting time and drying times. So for this event, it was kind of a new thing for me because I had to force time. I had to change, almost like the Matrix, I had to force the time change by using multiple, I used dryers, I used fans, I used cups. So I'll turn cups upside down with the liquid in it with no like small opening, and then set them quickly down. So it's very physical, as you know, you and I've discussed this, and it's a lot of physically durational like squats, and I'm hanging over it, and I'm in the painting, I'm standing on the painting, I'm coming out of the painting, I'm working in large physical gestures so that it goes beyond the wrist and the shoulder, it's going into the body and the torso. And it's not often that I always make a painting in a limited time, but for this particular piece in this event, it kind of was a tipping point of everything that I've ever done into this one moment in time. And so I think I answered your question, which is, how it's made. Yeah,
very cool. And how do you, the title Shadow Ring 2, where does that come from?
So Shadow Ring is a series I started. Shadow Ring 1 was a real simple arc and circle. It was one tone, it was in carbon black, and it set up the tone for these paintings. I made about 6 of them, and it's always starts with me in the center. It's like the center of the universe. So Shadow Ring is like an eclipse, and I'm in the center of this specific moment. Just like an eclipse, it only lasts for a very small amount of time. And so for me, looking at tipping points and these small, beautiful, sublime moments that we have in nature and in the universe, I wanted to amplify that through this particular series. So you'll see that there's the Shadow Ring series, and then the other painting, which we'll discuss, I'm sure, later, is another series that is also pretty current. So the Shadow Ring series is an ongoing series that I've created as of 2019. So it'll be
great. Great, yeah, very nice. Let's continue. Adriana, talk to us about this one, please.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I was brought into the fold by Sherri, who I so greatly admire. And yeah, so Vessel and a lot of my work from around this time was really an attempt to understand my father, who's an Irish immigrant. I think I've like conceptualized it a lot in the past, but I kind of lately just figured out in a way that it's all about understanding kind of a difficult relationship I have with my father and his roots and kind of the beliefs that he's instilled in me and my sister, not to get too personal, but so there's kind of 2 sides to my work from this period, which is having all of these old family photographs in which I felt there was some sort of like trauma that hadn't been resolved, or a story embedded within a photograph. So I treat a lot of photographs in general, but especially these groups as kind of like artifacts in their own right that require like an anthropological or kind of investigation into what may be missing. So I kind of approached it with the paint as a sort of like a rumination or thought process onto like a man that's a part of my family from my father's side that we knew so little of. He served for the English, though he was Irish, in World War II and against the Nazis, and he came away from that with incredibly difficult PTSD and alcohol issues. And so I was kind of trying to understand a man that to me symbolized a side of my family that is difficult to go into. Sorry, that's my cat. Yeah, so similarly to Sherri, which is amazing that we share this, is like a great athleticism around paint application. And I almost like to be exhausted after I step away from a piece, because it's something that is needed when working with stuff that is so intellectually, or perhaps in terms of thinking, a little bit heavy. Yeah, this is a oil on a photo transfer on canvas. So that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, great. Yeah, there's definitely a catharsis in both of both of the paintings that we see, not too dissimilar from, what the AbX artist were exploring in that mode. Okay, let me see. Okay, next. This is David Dexter's work. He's an artist primarily based out of California, but now living in Oregon, but definitely very West Coast, born and raised, and grew up there. So this work is called Mao Movement, and it's a play on sort of, first of all, it's a ceramic Tonto made last year, and it's a play on kind of these, American cartoon figures and Chairman Mao, this conflation or juxtaposition of like iconic China and iconic American or Americana. And he's interested in kind of absurdity and in sort of, pulling behind the curtain of taboos and uncomfortable conversations, like the relationship between, how I read this piece, like between the Chinese government and American government and society. That there's a lot of stuff that we may not see that happens. There's a huge switch from the past administration to the current administration, especially in its relationship to China, and how, where the country, the United States, is so dependent on China. China owns a lot of the debt, and there's a ton of trade, and there's a lot that's going on that is part of our reality, but we don't necessarily talk about in an everyday way. Like I always think personally, like, how is something $1 in the dollar store? Like, what are the costs involved? Whether it's like, it's not slave labor, but it's like a type of indentured servitude that's facilitating this American consumption economic thing. But then there's like a geopolitical switch that happens with that trade deficit. And so it's a play on this idea of Mao movement, bowel movement, consumption, excreting. And so it's like right on the line of discomfort. Okay. So Don Fritz, let's hear from you. This is your piece. Can you unmute yourself? Okay.
Oh, well, yeah, maybe. Let's see. Is that unmuting me? Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're perfect.
Okay. Yeah. I just woke up from a siesta. My brain is not really working too fast. I'm trying to like drink some coffee and wake up. It's Mexico, Para la siesta, acabo de llevando. And I'm really in a daze. Actually, when I do my work, I'm kind of in a daze. So let's use that as a segue. My work is an exploration of pop culture as I experience it. And recently I spent half the time in Mexico. So I kind of have an opportunity to look at what's going on maybe in our society from a different point of view, because I'm not in it all the time. So it seems really strange what's been going on culturally, politically. And this particular piece, it's obvious. It's about politics. It's about nationalism. It's about this crazy circus of iconography of people doing extreme things, just an extremely polarized activity, just talking about their, particular position as being the position, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats or the QAnon conspiracists. But basically, I don't know, that you can ask me questions because I'm not really feeling that articulate about it. But to me, it seems like it's a satire. It's kind of hard to satirize politics when it's already being satirized in real time, just on the news. It's crazy, don't you guys think? I mean,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
And when I'm in Mexico, I kind of feel like I'm away from it in a different kind of a crazy world. It seems like a Fellini world. Yesterday, okay, this is kind of like just things that happen here that I think are wonderful. Okay, I'm going to the hardware store and I'm up the big city and I'm stopped at a stoplight, which is an opportunity for people to kind of make money because you're like stopped in a car and they just walk up and they like start cleaning your window. You're like, I don't want you to clean my window. They're like, shh, they clean it anyway. So I'm like, okay, I got a clean window. Meanwhile, another guy is like a performer kind of dressed like Michael Jackson, this kid. Cars are stopped. Now this happens like in about stopping at a light. What is it, like 2 minutes? Maybe. Anyway, he strings a cord from post to post like a tightrope. He stands on it and balances on one foot and juggles 3 machetes in the air while people are stopped at the stoplight as an opportunity to make some money. And I'm like, this is insane. This guy is juggling 3 machetes, balancing on one foot. And it's just happening just because I stopped at this particular stoplight. And the next stoplight, there'll be somebody else doing some other activity. But it's like kind of like a Fellini movie in real time. I think it's wonderful. And I don't feel this kind of hate and anger in this culture as I do in our in America, and it's just like a wonderful escape for me. And this is where I do a lot of my work. I put up paper. I work on paper. Okay, well, what should I talk about? Process. I work on paper because it's easy to transport. I bring rolls of paper down here to my studio. I built the studio. You know, air conditioned. It's really wonderful. I just go out there. I work all day. And I have enough space to put up like 6 drawings, and I just bounce around between drawings and explore different iconography. And I don't really know what I'm going to do when I start necessarily in terms of what particular iconography I'm going to explore. But yeah, this one was about politics. But yeah, I work on like about 6 drawings at a time, and it takes me usually about, I don't know how much time I spend on these. It's sort of self-reflective. I mean, I just kind of thinking about narratives and different things that are happening within this particular, drawing. And I put images in and I erase them and I layer over them. And I guess for me, it's an attempt to kind of create a sort of the feeling of a living experience of memory that, people have a lot of thoughts in their head. I do, right. Anyway.
Yeah,
so I
and
want to record this.
There's a cacophony. I also think it's interesting that you here you feature largely like political imagery and clown imagery. And clown, there's this performative, over the top
right
kind of action.
It's taking things to the extreme. Like clowns to me are an example of just pushing everything to the extreme. Whatever sadness, happiness, I'm very interested in a juxtaposition of opposites, like, I don't know, saints, religion, sex, saints, clowns, politics, nationalism, government, religion, the idea of female, male, and what that means, and kind of just playing around with a lot of conflict. Can I show? I don't know how to show a screen. I have some other works that I think are more intense, but I don't know. Why don't you ask me questions? I'm rambling. If you have particular questions,
We can let's continue. Yeah, or we can continue through the slideshow.
Okay.
But I think that's a good introduction to your work.
Okay. Okay, great.
So this is Bruce Eichelberger's piece, House of Worship. And what's intriguing about this piece is that there's just everything he made from scratch. And there's wood, gold, garnets, turquoise, silver, emerald, coral, bone, abalone, ink, and pyrography and hand carving. And inside there's a human torso. I might post some pictures of the details, but this is really, so this is the artist looking at his work. He's a self-taught artist, LA based, and a lot of this, you were talking about the juxtaposition between like religion and sexuality, and that's a core theme in his work, working through personal trauma and social trauma, the indoctrination of the church, and also the abuses that happen within the church context. And it's such a, I think it's so unsettling and destabilizing because of what the church promises, you know, and it's not through and through and everywhere, but I saw just recently there was like another case of like an altar boy in the Vatican right now who's become a priest but is accused of, during his time as a teenager, committing horrific acts of sexual abuse. And I think, you know, for Bruce, it's a personal experience that he's trying to unveil, unmask, bring to the surface. And he's had a lot of, you know, people kind of protest his work or have a very strong reaction because it is so explicit, because it is so strong and intense. But that's this, I mean, in my opinion, that is the space that art exists in. It exists in the space where that kind of dialogue and discussion can happen. So this is, you know, sort of the big, a huge sculpture that he'd been working on for a long time. That's why it is featured in this show. Sherri, this is your other piece. Can you talk a little bit about this series?
Sure. So this piece is Everybody No One, and the title of this work is Bandana Manana. And I started exploring the idea of bringing an iconographic image back into my work. I mean, I'm classically trained. I work, I freelance still in the morning in fitness, but I'm kind of more of the nerd in fitness. So I've gone to the University of Connecticut for cadaver study because it complements the art, right? So I've gotten to look at the ins and outs of human anatomy. I studied the biomechanics of human anatomy, and I love old masterwork. I love symbology. I know that most people are probably more familiar with my abstract expressionist tone, but this is something that I wanted to explore and bring back this idea. It's almost like duality in a way, in that everybody, when you take everything off and you strip it down to the bones, we're just, I know this is probably nothing new, and I'm not the first to say it, we are all the same. And so I wanted to unify, especially once the pandemic kind of got into gear, I wanted to bring that up to the surface. And this is actually a project I started in 2018. I took the photos of this skull with my bandanas in 2018, and I sat on the project thinking about it, spending a lot of time at the Met, looking at Tiepolo and these Valentine de Boulogne and Caravaggio and light. And you'll see in some of my posts, there's a little bit of flavoring in everything that I do, the physical, the performative. I'm a color nerd. I'm sure all artists are, you know, to some degree color nerds, but I wanted to give it time. And then what came out of it is when the pandemic kind of got into gear, I thought, wow, this is kind of divine timing. So I set about coming into the studio and setting up my own stamp. And it literally, the kind of the mantra that goes with this is the idea of literally the Latin word for memento mori is we must die. And so my counter inoculation to it, since we're all getting vaccinated, is let's live, because I don't want to live in fear. Most of you guys don't maybe not follow me, but during the pandemic, and I'm not saying that you don't have to have fear, but for me particularly, I realized I was already living a pretty pandemic lifestyle. I was like waking up, art, sleep, me, walk the dog, repeat. Also through the pandemic, I went to Vegas for a mental health awareness art event. I mean, I just had to continue to live, and while doing that, doing research on iconography of rosary beads and high fashion of souls was a thing. It was, I don't know, it was the Gucci of the 1700s to wear rosaries with half tissue, half skull beads. You know, it was a kind of charm. It was I think you kind of touched on it, Katerina, with the Mao piece of a form of economic status. And so I think all those things kind of came together for this particular series that I'm currently working on right now. I'm still working on it. I have some new pieces that aren't up. But.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's interesting, the sort of the awareness of the body and the self, you know, in time, and both works. There's that. Okay, mm-hmm. So here is Monica's piece.
Oh, wow.
Can you unmute?
Hi. So I apologize. My internet is really unstable. You guys hear me okay? Okay, and so I may pop in and out and break up, so just let me know if I miss a talking prompt, or if someone asked me a question and I missed it, or if I cut out when I was talking. So yeah, so I apologize for the unstable internet. Doing my best in my studio with a hotspot. So yeah, this is a new series. This is one of a new series that I started just since the pandemic. And I think so. I've always like kind of ebbed and flowed between more formal work and figurative work. But even when I work in abstraction, it always comes from the figure a good bit and relates back to the ideas of faces and human forms. But I also am really just decided to let myself let the material sort of tell me what I'm seeing. So that's why I use this kind of ink on synthetic paper, where the water and the ink just kind of flow and create new forms. And I sort of read them like tea leaves or Rorschach tests, and you know, whatever ends up sort of showing itself to me, I let myself draw it, and whether it's silly or scary or fun or absurd. But then since the pandemic, in March, I guess, when we were kind of locked down for a few months, I don't know why, but that kind of drove me to focus on something that I'd been wanting to, but was always like on the back burner, to just get back into drawing people I love and focusing on portraiture. And I feel like I've always wanted, like I started coming out of that, you know, I started that as a kid. In art, and I always draw people on the train, my more specific practice. But for whatever reason, being stuck at home and baking all day and painting and having kids and being stuck at home with them, I just wanted to draw the people I saw both on Zoom and in my reality. And so I went ahead and dove into it. And so the series that came out of doing those just letting myself focus on that. Ended up being these like double figures. And so this was one of a friend, like one of the few friends who, once you could start visiting a little bit, you know, this was a difficult visit. You can see she's had a mask on, and I think we must have been after vaccination or something, because she was okay with taking the mask down. So, but it ended up being all double figures. And so that's what this series has become. So it's studies of people that in my life, and this is a double figure. And this one is, you know, obviously it's not two people, but I feel like the plant became a figure, the dog's sort of a figure, right? So it could kind of go either way as far as the double figures go. And that happened after the first few that I started working on. And it was, I didn't realize that I was doing all double figures until I had a studio visit with someone and they were asking me, you know, the significance of it. So it's like what often happens, I think, in the practice of making art. You don't always have a full plan as far as why you're using a certain number of elements. And then as you go and you look back, you see that it's about relationships, or you understand that it's about the connection between two people or between, you know, so that's what I realized. And then stick with it. So I'm still working on this series. Will continue to be two figures for this series. They're all the same size. They're all 60 by 60 inches with this ink on paper. It's synthetic paper. That's how it creates these kind of pools and spills that make up the image and kind of create some ghost-like images that I like to believe are sort of the materials making up their own mind in a way, so that I don't have that much control over it. So it's like a back and forth. So between me controlling some elements and the materials themselves kind of doing their own thing. I can't believe my Wi-Fi worked. Did I stay on for all of that? I didn't cut out.
You did. There's a teeny bit of like slow down, speeding up, but for the most part, I would say it's a 9 out of 10 in terms of communicability. Yeah, definitely. It's interesting because I've always thought of like this work, or I've been thinking about this work as very intimate and intense, but what's fascinating is that you're presenting it within the picture plane as opposed to just between you and the subject by having that two-figure dynamic. It's really intriguing. And I think that's, you know, a lot of people were really missing that during the pandemic. And so there was this kind of hunger for that connection in that space. And what I'm also intrigued by, how you've all had a chance to speak about your work so far, is how much you like trust yourself in the uncomfortable space of not knowing and being in the flow and letting the materials determine the form to some degree, you know, which is very different from other artists who have completely mapped out compositions or are really like deliberately process-based with a kind of grid-based approach to filling the picture plane. So, and I think that again speaks to a certain intensity, because you're not controlling it, right? The outer world has more power than what we can control as individuals. So sort of tapping into that. Okay, so let's continue. This is Sam Ticknor's piece. This is called Housemates, Gouache on Stretched Paper. I was able to speak with Sam at an exhibition she had with this on view in Dumbo. I think must have been in May. Yeah, in May. And so this is basically paper that's been stretched over a stretcher bar. And she does that when it's wet, and then applies the gouache. And her process, she also works in like graphic design, web stuff. So her practice involves making sketches, then articulating the idea for the composition through like a tablet or an iPad, doing some digital drawing, which is intriguing because it has this sort of flatness to it. Like another person who was seeing the show while I was at the gallery kept on saying, I can't believe these aren't posters, because they have this real flat directness to them. And I think that the process of making them informs the materiality here. So in a way, this is different from what we talked about, where there's a little bit more like abandon with the materials. This is a little bit more like the composition is determined. I think from the exhibition I saw, she does a lot of black and white ink works first for compositions, but it's in that space that she allows anything to happen. So here, you know, you have a couch with eyes, a lamp with eyes, a wall with eyes, and this little mouse or two mice going through the space. So that's where the absurdity, where the sort of rawness happens. And I thought this piece in particular has this sort of heat in the color palette, like it's a really limited color palette. And there's humor in it as well. And it's like we can kind of identify with the fact that during the pandemic, everybody was at home so much. And so it's almost like the home became more filled with life, literally, and more animated. And so that's how I read this piece. This is another piece by Dawn. You want to say a few words about this?
Well, it's the similar exploration of contrasts and, you know, the sublime and sort of the I don't know, good and evil, you know. This sort of iconic female-ish, this femme fatale, this iconic sort of superhero, saint, demon, all of the things that women are kind of imbued with these qualities, and these images are used so much to like just sell products and create fantastic movies that are just about, you know, the power of being a woman, you know, but how it's imbued with all this other stuff. So we've got kind of like demons here, men, you know, sort of chasing the demons that are making them do bad things, and I don't know. Again, there's a lot of sex and religion and all of this series that I've been doing. I've done hundreds of these drawings. These are just a few or a couple, but they're all similar. Mm-hmm. My work kind of evolved out of this autobiographical, kind of dealing with growing up in the 50s and trying to kind of deconstruct gender stereotypes and how toys and seemingly kind of harmless things are imbued with all of this this baggage, you know, of the way women and men are thought to be. So now it's kind of moved into this, from my childhood in the 50s into kind of more of a contemporary milieu, which is a little bit harder to work with because, you know, it's hard to talk about the women when you're a man, or gay people if you're straight, or, you know, racism, you know, if you're white. It's just like, it's just so difficult to do.
Right.
But I've been doing it. But I'm really uncomfortable with all the works. I don't really know what it's about, what they're about exactly. But I need to do it. It's like slay the demon, you know. It's like I just need to kind of get this work out and do it because I think it's important. And then I kind of figure out what it's about later. There's a lot of work I haven't shown because it just makes me feel too uncomfortable, especially working at Catholic school.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely a lot of, you know, expectations and what's considered appropriate or taboo. And, you know, we talk a lot about male white privilege in society, but we don't talk about like what some of the challenges legitimate challenges to being part of a conversation, you know, especially in a time where there's such a strong like aspect of cancel culture. Like it's you know, it's dangerous physically, professionally, to have complicated conversations. If
Oh yeah, you know, as a professor, like I've been called a racist by my students just because I'm talking about race. I just brought up the idea of how, you know, New York evolved from the immigrants coming in to kind of collecting together in different neighborhoods, like Little Italy. Said Little Italy, you know, Chinatown. They're like, oh, that's really racist. I'm like, well, no, it isn't. I mean, is it? I mean, it's just like a name of a place where people.
Well, I think, you know, how you use the floating compositions and it becomes like a cacophony. I think also because of how social media functions and the internet functions, like stuff gets so decontextualized and recontextualized, and it gets used to serve purposes. And so
I see.
even like actual footage gets spliced and re-shown to prove a point, you know. And so it's
manipulation,
right? And it's much easier to be on the offensive side than on the defensive side. Like, that's not to discredit the real, you know, need for anti-racism and feminism and awareness of, you know, body positive or ageism. I mean, those are all totally legitimate aspects. It's just that sometimes things get distorted and there's power in being the persecutor, right? It's happened historically, like Christianity persecuted, you know, more pagan religions, and then Catholicism persecuted, and Europeans persecuted in the United States. And I mean, there's just, and then there is changes of, you know, there's changes of perspective, there's flipping of that as well, to rebalance at times. And then sometimes it's hard to keep track. It's hard to keep track of what is like fair and right and good, because there is, you know, a lot of things that are communicated that are not explicit. And I think that that's what your work deals with, is like these large, generally seemingly innocuous icons that mean a lot, that are really heavy. Like, to me, what I am drawn to in this piece is this floating crown and cross, because, you know, the crown and the cross were super linked for a long time, and this is like a basis of power. And Christianity, you know, less people may be going to church now than before, but it does form the basis for a lot of our sort of cultural beliefs, you know, and traditions. I mean, a lot of things have become secularized, but you know, Christmas or St. Valentine's Day, or you know, they're just things that have been morphed into different aspects that deal with love or consumption and capitalism, you know. So it's intertwined, and I think that's what your work does, especially in the different like sizes of elements that emerge and contrast. Okay, so let's go to the next one.
I'd like to add that it's really interesting to kind of see your work as artifacts as well, like symbolic artifacts of a culture that has been built around these dreams, these ideas, these fallacies almost. And I think that they almost look like consumable stickers to me. And maybe that's odd, but I love your work. I just want to say that. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, please any questions or comments? So this is Carlos Dai's work. He was brought into the show by Dawn Fritz, and I had a chance to talk with him over Zoom on Monday, and it's interesting. So this is called Abuelita, and it's a cyclorama, meaning that you can go around and see, you know, a narrative evolve as you go around it. And I think it's interesting for Carlos because he is a, you know, master ceramicist, very traditional techniques, and does a lot of fabrication, and really, as Sherri mentions, like nerds out on like the chemical properties and the colors and the application of glazes. And I think for him, he's his one grandmother was German and one grandmother was Mexican, and he doesn't know that much about his Mexican grandmother, so he sort of imagines her, but he's much more connected to his German grandmother. But I think in California in particular, he comes across more as from his Mexican heritage, right? So there's this contrast of culture and identity. So in these works, he is also looking at media and pop culture, and he calls himself, or says about himself, that he was raised kind of like a TV baby. Like you know, the TV's always on, and his parents would just leave the TV on for him. And that was in the 70s. There were a lot of new like reality cop shows and gang violence on the nightly news, and so there's this constant juxtaposition between like an ad for cookies, then, you know, gang violence in Los Angeles, followed by I Love Lucy. And so this mashup of both external different like cultures and realities happening outside, and then on the TV, and then I think to some degree internally, because these become biographies about his life as well. Dawn, do you want to add anything? Because I know you know his work quite well.
No, you're so articulate. I think you do a nice job explaining, you know, where his experience and kind of where his work is coming from. He was my assistant in the studio, helping me with ceramics. I also make a lot of ceramic work. I kind of came out of that sort of funk art tradition in Davis, and so he's a ceramist, and he's helped me a lot. But no, I think that's really good what you said so far about Carlos.
So this is a piece by Bruce Eckleberger called Lost and Found, and he did a whole series of these, and they're artist-made frames. And again, it's, you know, this idea of sort of some kind of menacing figure in the background or behind in some institutional, which I think this building represents, institutional space, and then this child who's monumental in scale in this landscape that is vulnerable and lost. What I find intriguing in Bruce's work is this ability for him to, you know, empathize with these sort of range of characters, a little bit like Henry Darger's work, characters that are living in their own reality, kind of dealing with trauma. And Henry Darger, I was looking him up, he had, you know, he suffered a lot in his childhood, was in orphanages and experienced abuse, and sort of his work really comes out of sort of championing, you know, children, and giving them a narrative, you know, like empowering them through the visual narratives he created. Okay, so let's go on. This is Adriana.
Yeah. So before I was talking about kind of the two sides of investigating my dad and the Irish side of my family. And a lot of the beliefs that were instilled in me by him was kind of neoliberal, you know, quintessential immigrant beliefs in which hard work will pay off, hard work will pay off, hard work will pay off. And I was thinking about that and thinking about kind of the lineage of immigrant labor in the US. His family were all very poor farmers in Ireland, and he came to the States by himself. And so I was kind of filling in the gaps between what I perceived his upbringing to be and his beliefs, and how they may be culminated in the US. So I was working from this one image of Dust Bowl farmers that were immigrating towards the West, towards California, and kind of this idea of manifest destiny, which is so intrinsically tied with the American dream, and like the exploitation of labor, exploitation of immigrants for labor through this, you know, biscuit at the other end of the stick. I don't know how to explain it, but yeah, so another way of kind of looking at my history, or looking at my father, looking at even the land that I grew up in, which is California, and you know, this muddled history of native displacement and whatnot. So yeah, this piece kind of materially was a lot of give and take between like addition of oil paint and then utilizing a sanding down technique in which I could build this image up at my own speed, if you will. And kind of, I was looking at the sandpaper and sanding down the image as a way of like showing the fallacies within an image or an idea of immigrant labor and the American dream. So yeah.
Yeah, intriguing. It definitely has this feeling of a labored surface, but it's not built up. You know, it's this pushing and pulling of space. And you and I spoke a little bit about Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States, and how really like labor and race are so tied together, and race relations, like the conflict in race relations, were stoked for the benefit of capital in labor structures, right? So
Totally.
Laborers would organize into unions, and then there would be this distraction of like, oh, you guys don't get along because you're different races or ethnicities. Focus on that and don't focus on labor rights and unions, and challenging the work to, you know, money to capital relationship. So it's intriguing how it's connected.
And recently also like the environment, you know, I've been thinking about, I mean, as you know, as California is in a severe drought, and you know, Portland and places that would normally be quite cool in temperature are heating up. I'm just thinking about also this layers in the ground of touch, of human touch, and where does that get excavated, and how do you map that labor out? And you know, because there's all this interesting debate about individual responsibility around environmental rights and environmental protection, and then these larger corporations that are totally calling the shots behind the scenes, and where do you kind of, how do you insert yourself within that? So yeah, crazy. Yeah.
Okay, let's go next one. This is also Carlos Dye's work, and here he is exploring the flat picture plane of painting. He makes a bunch of these ceramic paintings, and kind of similar to what Monica, you were saying about having like an interaction between two figures. I found in another work that he showed me in his studio, he has just a few figures that are floating, not a whole cacophony or like cloud-like structure like in Don Fritz's work, but here it's like Olive has a relationship to this hunter, and then Death has a relationship to the hunter, and Death has a relationship to Olive, and this sort of contrasting of emotions and flavors, but presented in a pretty accessible, familiar way. And then he spends a lot of time in the physicality of the patina and the kind of painterly glaze application in the background. But it's intriguing because here, you know, sexuality is only sort of hinted at, but it becomes like, you know, what is the relationship between Olive and the hunter? And Death and the hunter, we have a sense, but like, what about Olive and Death? So again, very intriguing and narrative based. Okay, this is, yeah.
For a second. Of course. I would say about his work that wouldn't be apparent if you're not a ceramist is that each of these layers is applied, you know, with glaze and put in the kiln and brought up to cone temperature. And it's an amazing tour de force in ceramic technique. No one's taught him this. He's just kind of figured it out on his own. It's really difficult to do this with ceramic because you can't go back and fix or change anything like a painting. You can just go on endlessly and correct mistakes and do whatever to improve the image. But this is like, you know, one shot, you do it and see how it turns out. And it's kind of like opening a package at Christmas. You're always surprised at what you get. But he's managed to control this process. I'd say this is probably a piece that has, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, like 6 different firings, you know, applications, and then put it in the kiln, bring it up to temperature, 1800 degrees, take it out, see what you get, put some more glaze on it, put it back in the kiln. So anyway, I just love his work because of what he's been able to figure out how to do. And he didn't learn it from a book. He just learned it from trial and error.
Experimentation.
And,
yeah.
Who he's worked with. And
the colors are so specific, and he was saying how the glazes, and I have a little bit of experience with the glazes, when they go on initially, they don't look like the colors that they'll turn out to be.
Right.
So he's able to match things so perfectly.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Monica.
Hi again. So I really like what you were saying about Carlos's work. Actually, I can relate to that a lot, and that's, I think, why I moved into drawing more than painting at some point, just because of that immediacy. And it's like you lay something and it's there, and like paint, or you know, so it's kind of, the surface is all there, and everything's transparent to some degree. And I can, you know, I also have like very minimal experience with like ceramic glazes, but you know, when those transparencies, everything's there, you can't completely get rid of any mark that was made. And I completely embrace that aspect of drawing, where whatever I'm doing at that moment is recorded and it's there as a part of the finished work at the end of the day, no matter what. So regardless of my feelings about that mark, it's going to remain there to some degree. So that's a part of how I work, is just like accepting that and embracing that. And then this piece was made directly from some of the drawings I was doing on Zoom. So I was teaching on Zoom for a long time and having all of our faculty meetings, and you know, like everyone, it was a lot of that and it was a little overwhelming. And so even this, like you know, it can feel, it's a different kind of burnout when you're on a screen all day as opposed to in person with people. And so to cope with it, I certainly drew people, and actually I just drew one of you now. So even though I've been paying attention, but I also have been like, you're there. And so I'm going to use this opportunity. And so like this drawing is two of my colleagues, and I like them both very much. Although I feel like through this, I didn't know them all that well, but they were on the Zoom screen a lot. Drawn because and you know, like I feel like I got to know them by staring at them and looking at them and drawing them as they may or may not have been talking in a meeting, but maybe I got to know some aspect of them, right? Right. And like this is Adriana. Sorry if you don't appreciate this, but this is like as we've been talking, I just did this little sketch of Adriana.
Wait, keep that there. I want to take a picture.
And this is the first, you know, this is the first time I've met you, but I feel like I gained some deeper insight by doing like a little doodle of you. And it's also just like you know, it's like a combination of coping and utilizing this opportunity. I feel like I don't know about anyone else, but I know that I felt like there was like some wasted time, or I felt like with all the online meetings and communicating with people on the computer, it felt like there was some kind of wasted time. And so that was like, well, at least if I'm on a meeting via the screen, at least I'm drawing, at least I'm practicing, at least I'm looking and, you know, trying to figure out something visually there. And it isn't, and I do have empathy for my students who like doodle while they listen, because I was paying close attention to you while you were talking, Adriana, while I was sketching you. It was really interesting to hear about, you know, the story of your father's background and your personal relationship, and what that means today, based, you know, and how that enters your practice, and how that kind of funnels through to your concerns with environment. Totally understand my students when they're also doodling and also listening. And I just got my sign that my connection's unstable, so if I froze up, sorry about that.
It just sort of like slows down and speeds up again. Yeah, and I love this piece. I really loved. I like the weight in the background, and the way you titled it, atmospheric pressure, gives us that sense of sort of the Zoom burnout that people have experienced. I just started a summer session class yesterday, and at the very beginning I told students, I said, please take out your sketchbook. You're all welcome to draw, sketch, notate, doodle while I talk. If you feel like you can't multitask, that's fine, it's up to you. But there, you know, people process information in different ways, and if it helps you absorb the information, also be engaged, and you can, you know, practice some of your sketch ideas, go ahead and do that. Because I think I know what you mean. It's I would say that instead of feeling it's a waste of time, to me it feels like sometimes that there's a stagnancy in the energy because of the fact that it's all contained in a little box, you know, in Zoom, as opposed to like when you're in a classroom, you can walk around and see things and talk to people, or in a meeting, it's like just more physically, spatially dynamic. Okay, so let's continue. This is Sam Ticknor's piece, Soul House. When I first saw this piece, I didn't realize it was a 4-part piece, and I was really intrigued, especially by this bottom right panel, because it's such a familiar, like we're all doing this right now, it's such a familiar space where you have your laptop open and sometimes multiple tabs open, and it's just like your whole world gets like vacuumed or sucked into that space. And these were made also during the pandemic, and it's a lot about sort of loneliness, isolation, the sort of desolate city scene in the first area, and then just again, how intense or animated the interior space of the bedroom or the living room become. So that's this piece. And this is Dave Dexter's piece. This is called Tonto's Indian Casino. And again, in his work here is a mashup of provocative imagery. And it's not like, gore provocative or pornographic provocative, but it's provocative because it gets you to think about, Tonto as a sort of invented Indian caricature of Native American culture. And, the casinos are sort of social compensation for creating some sort of industry for Native Americans, but then it's not, a lot of Native American communities struggle with alcoholism, and usually casinos are a place where, you get unlimited free booze. So it's like, I feel like his work touches these live wires, but you're not exactly sure what the live wires are, but it's a sort of discomfort. And again, he's a white male, so he's dealing with race, culture issues that are in some ways a little bit taboo for him to talk about. And then this is the Lone Ranger, who is known for, being a hero in the Wild West, populated with Native Americans too, right? The whole Indians versus cowboys story that's part of the Western or Midwestern to Western story of the United States. So this also a little different than the other Mao movement that is just about like objects and objects and objects. This one has a cacophony of scales and clues, and I feel like there's an intensity to also the application of paint. Dave has an ability to create this trompe l'oeil effect in his paintings, and so he's able to get things to such a realistic level, and then is able to bring a distressed quality into that realism. So it's almost like it's like a challenge to the perfectionism that he's capable of displaying in this realistic representational mode that he works in. So yeah, I thought this was pretty provocative with this issue of Native American narrative in the United States. And I think, thank you everybody for participating in this, and we can just like have a little discussion about like things that are going on in studio or that's coming up. If anybody, wants to share.
Well, I want to just touch back on something that was said that we discussed with Monica's work and Carlos's work, and that was about process. And I love what Monica said about the drawing component for her, because for me, and I didn't really get into it, but a stain is a commitment, right? Because we know when we stain our rug with wine, that's an unfortunate commitment that you can't undo. And so when I paint with the stain, I thought of how Dawn was describing the process, and you just have to, there's something magical about that, knowing that your limbic brain has to come up a little bit, you turn the volume up a little bit, and you just trust the failure or trust the process that is going to push you into, the failure is going to inform you into something else. And maybe that is, you could parallel that with what's going on in the pandemic, and you can parallel that to other components in your life that are informing the creative process. And I just, there was just something beautiful about what was said about Monica's work and Carlos's work, and the idea that you can't undo it. You know, like I remember as a kid,
there's a commitment to it.
Yeah, you know, like when I gesso a surface and then I go, oh no, I don't like that. You can't, you know, there's something awesome about that with oil, right? There's something great that you can just go, no, we've all had that moment, we're like, wow, and you kind of, but what I love about the way that Monica works is she's saying, you know, that she's just gonna watch this material with something above it do its thing, and you have to, there's this letting go, and I think it's faith, you know. And so if we're talking about religion, I just love that we're kind of, you know, it's a little bit of that without being religious.
I'm glad you brought that up also, Sherri. I think it also has to do for me, like I always love the idea of the meaning of the work coming from the communication, right? Like it like when like the work changes depending on who's seeing it, right? And depending on who's experiencing it based on them bringing their own, right? Like that's just as important to me as what I'm bringing to it, right? And so the same way, it's like this conversation with the material, with whoever's looking at it, with, you know, the materials doing their own thing, and then a stranger or a friend I think it's that I like the thought of faith, and I'm never sure how it's fully coming into play for me, because I also grew up Catholic as someone else, and it really has so much to do with why I ended up making art, but I'm not really sure exactly how it's embedded itself into my work, right? Other than there's a certain belief in the power of what's being said, and how I need to accept that something's telling me and something's revealing itself. And there is that kind of, that what you brought up in the idea of faith. But I also, I kind of walk this line between the absurdity of that and the power of it at the same time. And so when it turns out to be absurd or just ridiculous, I embrace that in the same manner that I would embrace, you know, something more steadfast showing itself to me, or some deeper universal meaning revealing itself. The fantastic part of it, or the just ridiculous part of it, is just as powerful to me.
Yeah, like working from like a stain, or working from one kind of unsure gesture sometimes is so interesting, because it's sort of like fishing in your mind for a memory. Like, you know, Proust talks a lot about kind of fishing in his childhood for certain moments that as we grow older, it's easier and easier to forget. So I appreciate how you're working kind of backwards from kind of unsureness to something specific. It's lovely. Yeah. Also, yeah, my dad grew up Catholic, and what was the artist who was, I'm so bad with names.
Bruce Eckleberger.
Yeah, my dad grew up in, like, he was sent to boarding school, and most of his friends, if not all, were abused by this one priest. Not to get too personal, but it's a crazy kind of generational trauma that goes on from this one point. And, you know, I've talked about this with my mom a lot, but men also need some sort of protection and catharsis from pain that has happened in their lives. And there has to be a way to talk about it without feeling like you're giving attention to the wrong thing, because everybody feels pain. So yeah, I wish he was here, because that would be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, supposedly he's, I talked to his wife a lot for getting the image and stuff. He's very shy, introverted, but like just pours everything into his work. And I wanted to mention, Sherri, when you bring up this idea of faith, a lot of cultures see art making as a form of prayer, right? Like whether it's Tibetan sand painting, directly a form of prayer, or in other, I mean, I'm familiar with it in some Eastern traditions and philosophies, that it's seen as what you're offering. It's an offering. And even more specifically, sometimes those very ornate paintings in Tibetan art, the more labor, the more valuable the prayer is. And the people who commission those paintings or buy those paintings, it's kind of like their ticket into, you know, a better afterlife. Like it's really literally this connection and an offering to sort of a religious, yeah.
Oh, sorry, there's a little delay. Just to add to that, on the Tibetan side and then the Native American side. So the shadow ring paintings that I started a couple of years ago now, shortly after the painting behind me was made, I went to New Mexico and had an opportunity to go to the Acoma Pueblo reservation. They're called, you might have seen this in my Instagram, but it's called Sky City, and it sits on a high mesa, and it's the oldest inhabited city in the United States. It's 14,000 years old or something like this, and then they were conquered by the Spanish about 400 years ago. And I went for their harvest, and I got to be, it's kind of amazing. I got blessed by the elders, but the whole point was there was this whole performative dance that incorporated these, the women from the eldest to the youngest, the women, the oldest, the elder women and men in line in one line and women in another line, from oldest to youngest, would form these lines and dance in this, I'll call it the square, but in the center of their little town that has no running power, by the way. It's all power generated. And there's secret ways. The ancient way to go up is the way I went up, but there's a drive up now. But anyway, so they would make these dances and then turn like a Rorschach, right? And the youngest, it's almost like two snakes dancing. So the youngest were the tails, which is where the rattle is, you know, so to speak, the rattlesnake. So the tails are, you know, like children do, they're just kind of being free and all this. And the one thing I wanted to point out about this event was that the women wore these wooden tablets that sat on their head in a square, and either it was hand painted beautifully, this is very simple, rainbow or cloud or corn. And they wore these tablets, and then the men wore pine branches on their arms, because the mountains that surround the mesa far off in the distance are all sacred mountains. So I got to see this beautiful ceremony. And again, I look at faith as an open thing, and that's, I'm sorry to give you this detailed experience, but I think faith for me goes beyond the religious, as we're discussing it. It goes into the faith to like commit to stains, or to watch, as Monica was saying, the idea of material doing its thing. And I just think faith right now, and where the climate we're in America, I like looking at the counter of the tough and, or the fear, the scared, the frustrated, the everything. So I'm really heavily invested in concepts of faith and how to portray that through my painting process. And it seems like there's a theme of that you've somehow captured it through the Intensity show, and I just needed to point that out.
Yeah, thank you. That's really great observation and sort of summation of it, because it's interesting, you know, like first I had these names as placeholders for the exhibition. And then I thought, you know, I like the fact that it's so direct, like it's so just is what it is. And it doesn't have to have like a, you know, long meandering title with wordplay in it to be profound or, you know, relevant. So it's interesting that you bring that up, because when I think about intensity, I was thinking mainly in like the overt, But I think what you're talking about is more like the experiential part, especially from the maker's perspective. And that's, I believe, what kind of joins you guys together in a way. I mean, there's a lot of other, similarities and cross pollinations of approaches and concepts. I'm so happy that this worked out. Thank you for joining us.